everybody, welcome back to this week's episode of The Followers. We're episode 54, I believe, and yes, nailed it. Today's episode is a really exciting one, so it's on all things recovery, and it's with Lorcan Daly, so it was really, really interesting to delve into an area that I can only really see getting bigger over the next couple of years. It's kind of really in its infancy, so it's good to explore what we have at our disposal now, what works, what doesn't, what we still don't know about. What do you think of it, Murph?
I think it's interesting that doing a full PhD on recovery, it still just distills back to the basics. It's like, well, first of all, make sure you're sleeping, eating and drinking right, and then just have well planned out training programs. You can sprinkle some specific recovery stuff on top of that, but without those, it's all a bit of a waste of time, unless you're a super genetic freak that was super fit to start off with.
Yeah, and that's it. And a lot of the time, stuff that you feel in your head is de-stressing you or making you calmer. 99% of the time it probably is. So even if it's not, oh, LeBron James isn't doing it, so it's probably not the best thing for recovery, everybody's different. So everyone has their own little things that they do to relax and to recover, and that's just as important as, say, I don't know, if you like Normatec boots or if you have something like that. Just making sure you get stuff that works for you.
No, really interesting episode. Lorcan, absolute gent to talk to as well, and hopefully we'll find out more from in the future and more studies that he conducts.
Yep. All right, without further ado, enjoy the episode.
Lorcan, a Mayo man living in... Are you in Westmead or Roscommon, or are you just putting yourself...
Just the Westmead side of the river there, so...
Oh, so you've come all the way across from Connacht to Leinster. You're not even staying in Connacht anymore.
No,
I was going to say, how were you feeling about the under 20 result the other night? Jeez, you must have been running around your Mayo colours all the time. And then, just like Homer Simpson going back into his bush.
Yeah, a bit of a shock, yeah. Sure, Kev is Roscommon anyway, so I've heard all about it, right? So
yeah, no harm. Give us a little bit of background there. Currently in a PhD, finishing up in the next couple of months there, largely around recovery. But what brought you to that? Were you someone who just was wrecked after training and was like, how am I going to get over this? Is that what led you down the path, or was it just progressively you ended up there?
I suppose my undergraduate thesis was looking at kind of mechanisms of fatigue, and then we kind of delved into that at the start of the studies. Initially, we had planned to kind of do maybe a longer term monitoring thing with underage elite players, but with COVID, we had to kind of reroute that. So we had to kind of think, what might we do now? So I suppose the logical thing after looking after fatigue is to kind of go into recovery and that end of it. So that's kind of how we got here, all right?
And your undergrad, that was in Athlone as well. Was that sports sciences or health sciences?
Sports science, yeah. So just the 8 years here now it will be. So yeah, so it's just, I suppose, just kind of, it's the same supervisors and everything's the same. So it's just kind of a logical flow from what we did with the undergraduate to the postgrad, and then just kind of followed on from that.
There's certainly a growing research group there in Athlone at the minute with the
we're taking
research group, but other stuff as well.
There's kind of, with the SHE research, I suppose, because there's so many male participants in sports science literature, like we're just kind of bridge that a bit. But there's a lot of stuff on kind of menopause and affected period and different things like that on sports and kind of female specific stuff. So it's very interesting and kind of all novel research. So and obviously with team sport athletes that are female, it'll be interesting to see is there kind of differences in training or things like that.
And you're largely looking at recovery. You've broken it up into kind of 4 to 5 studies. You want to just give us a general overview of where you started, or what are some of the main aims you're looking to find towards the end?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing we wanted to do was just assess the timeline of recovery in Gaelic football. So it was done in every other sport, kind of Australian rules, soccer and all that, but there's nothing really specific for Gaelic football. So we basically want to identify what kind of happens to players during and after a match, and how long does it take them to kind of get back to pre-match baseline, you might say. And then follow on to that, we want to see, well, does kind of physical conditioning impact these responses? And that was kind of study 2. And then on to study 3, we're kind of looking at relationships between these components, fitness and then the player's workload. So it's just kind of looking at the influence of physical conditioning and different markers of components, fitness, and how that impacts basically fatigue, recovery, and also workload. And then following on from that, we're kind of exploring recovery strategies. So that's what we were doing most recently in our research with our big survey there we had.
So if we stay at the start then, how are we measuring baseline? How do we measure how recovered we are, how fatigued we are, everything that way? Like, is there a way of measuring it? Is it just kind of a person's perceived scale, or can be a little bit more objective about it?
Yeah, we have kind of psychological and physical measures. So we kind of got an array of things. So we use markers of muscle damage. So we use creatine kinase here. So that's kind of an enzyme that you can monitor. So if you have muscle damage, basically you can get tears in the muscle, and this then leaks into the bloodstream. And we just measure the amount of that. So if more has leaked out, it's like a surrogate sign that there's been more damage. And we also looked at perceptual measures, so sleep, stress, mood, how sore were your muscles, things like that. We assess the player's neuromuscular performance. We have a performance measure, so we use the drop jump and vertical jump just to see their power. And we also looked at the in-game workload and kind of related them back to that. So we use StatSports GPS for those, and then just kind of looked at the relationships. So obviously we did that before, during, and then after the game, and then 24 hours, 48 hours post match, just to kind of see, do they go up or down, or how long does it take to get back to baseline?
What kind of stuff were we seeing there? Like, was there a big individual difference that some players recovered really quickly, some took way longer? Were some markers recovering much quicker and others taking way longer?
Yeah, so just, I suppose, in terms of the markers themselves, the physiological and the metabolic markers, so the performance and the creatine kinase, they were reached a peak kind of disturbance 24 hours post match. But then the perceptual kind of measures, so the players felt most fatigue immediately after the game, but all the other markers were kind of worse 24 hours. So that kind of might suggest we might need multiple monitoring tools if you kind of want to get an overall picture of players' kind of well-being or preparedness to train.
What I'm just wondering, just before we jump into this in any more detail, what level were you? What level of athlete were you actually researching, or did you have it across a couple of different levels?
Yeah, so it was just senior club players. So we worked with a few clubs in the kind of area, so in Roscommon and Westmeath here. So we just kind of had, like, they were high enough standard of club player. That's kind of what we were going for. So maybe down the line we were kind of planning to work with intercounty or see is there differences in responses. But with COVID, we were kind of a year out of testing, so we had to kind of reroute. But just to go back on where the response is different, there's big individual differences, especially in things like creatine kinase. There could be mad differences, but what you're looking for is the general trends. Are they all going up or down? So we saw things like players' physical conditioning has a big impact on their responses. So if you're a fitter player or a stronger player, what we'd find is first of all, they complete more work. But then even despite doing this, they actually recover quicker than their counterparts. So it's like a two-pronged benefit. You can do more work and also kind of be ready to train faster as well. So it's quite interesting.
The test for creatine kinase, is it very invasive or is it relatively simple?
It's not too bad. It's just like a finger prick. So it's just a drop of blood, but it can be a bit tricky if we were testing at halftime as well. So you can be kind of limited by time. And if the team is losing, the coach doesn't really want to see you doing anything like that. Or another issue, if it's very cold now, it could be hard to get the blood out, things like that. But it's not too bad, really. And all the measures are fairly quick to administer, so quite handy.
We had someone else on who was running around at halftime taking finger prick samples for someone, didn't we, John?
Was it not James Moore? And they took a decent
yeah.
sample. Like, they were taking a test tube worth of blood. They had the tourniquets on the arms and pulled it right out and everything. Yeah. Halftime in pro rugby league. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he had a similar enough thing too, that if things weren't going well, you'd feel like you were out of place.
But was it the second day that they won and all the players said it was seeing blood at halftime that fired them up going out for the second half?
Yeah.
So at the end of the season in their big game, they actually asked James to come back and take blood. He didn't need it for any study at all. It was just like, no, we really want you to come. That was the best thing ever. We played so well after it.
Just a bit.
No one's asked you to come back and take the finger pricks.
No, they're all glad to see me gone, I think. But just on the CK, an interesting find that even before the game, what we noticed was that it was maybe between 5 and 20% higher than kind of under other team sports. So looking at Australian rules or rugby league. So that was kind of maybe an indicator that the players weren't fully recovered from their previous match or training when they were going into matches. So we were taking them in competitive matches kind of in the mid-season. So that was an interesting finding that they maybe had done too much or weren't recovered.
They're two interesting points in general. Like, the fitter and stronger you are, like, it obviously, like, the performance benefits of that are well established. That you will cover more ground, you will get more work in, which doesn't always lead to better performance, but often does. But the fact that you, even by doing that, you still recover faster, it's a it's a nice incentive to be fitter and stronger. Were they league matches or championship matches they were playing though?
They were league, yeah. So it was
Yeah.
league towards the end of the
Yes.
league.
Sometimes you will have teams who are just like, no, we're prioritizing championship. We're going to train a little bit through it. We're not going to cut it back. So
yeah,
sometimes you
could
have
have
to bear
been.
that in mind as well.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of different factors, all right, that could have influenced it, but it's very interesting, all right. It might be different in championship. That's a good point.
And was there much of a connection between the age profile of those who recovered better, or was it just simply those who were fitter or stronger did recover better? Or was there a follow up with younger players versus older players? Was there any differences seen there?
Yeah, actually, we didn't. We ran correlations and kind of multiple regressions. We used all the components of fitness and body composite. We didn't actually assess age at all. But just off the top of my own head, there was some, we say, like players just coming out of minor or playing minor that might have been involved with a few teams, and their fatigue kind of readings were very high before the match. So I think one player had like 2,000 as the unit for the CK, and you might expect maybe 200. So he's very high going into a match and quite sore. So it may be the case the younger players might be involved or doing more work as a result of being with school teams or alternative teams, or maybe other sport as well. So that would be interesting to maybe explore the age categories, see was it different. But the fitness did have a big impact for sure.
And any specific components of fitness over others? Like a lot of people think, oh, the more flexible I am, the quicker I'll recover. Was flexibility shown to relate to it, or was it other aspects?
We didn't actually assess flexibility. So what we looked at was measures of strength, power, vertical jump, kind of run and speed, 520 meters, and we did blood lactate responses. And what we generally found, it was kind of similar to other work previously done. It was basically strength and aerobic capacity. Those were the best predictors of players' capacity to recover. So I suppose if you think of it logically, the stronger players, kind of all the accelerations and decelerations of a match, because they're stronger, it causes less damage in the first place, and so they might recover better. And in a similar fashion, I suppose the fitter players, the high intensity work and all that, they'll be able to recover quicker between the games, and then obviously be less fatigued than afterwards. So but those were the two markers that kind of had the best indicators. Other things had maybe some correlation, but those were the strongest.
It makes sense that like the more aerobically developed you are, the quicker you're able to bring your heart rate back down after each high intensity action. Plus, you're probably just not getting your heart rate as high each time. When it does come down, it's at a lower resting heart rate than probably someone who is less fit, all like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Definitely.
You mentioned before, I was on a webinar where body composition was probably one of the strongest associations.
For workload, yeah. So they were actually quite different, the markers for recovery and then the workload. Well, there was big overlap as well, obviously. But in terms of players' workload, what we found was body composition, aerobic capacity again, and kind of lower body power and short distance speed. Those were the best predictors for overall workload. But it will be interesting to see maybe in other populations, or maybe more elite populations, the body composition mightn't have had such a big impact. So I suppose the fact that they were kind of club level, there might be some players with higher body fats that kind of hindered them more. Whereas if they were all more elite, it mightn't have had such an impact.
Possibly a slight genetic component there. Like we can probably all think a lad who rocks up the train every 2 weeks is ripped and just buzzes around the field with hardly any training. Whereas you're probably like there's probably nothing that a lot of inter-county players are already like that. They're kind of just, a little bit higher up the genetic lottery as opposed to some lads who maybe aren't like.
Definitely. But I suppose with the body fat, it's going to have a big impact, I suppose, at just your work rate over the course of a game. Joe, if you're carrying a lot of extra weight or body fat, it's kind of weighing you down every acceleration, deceleration, landing from a jump, all that's a bit harder. And that can influence the work rate. And as well, even during in the weather like now when it's very hot, it's harder to dissipate heat if you've got a lot of excess fat, things like that. All that can kind of add up to just more physiological strain, I suppose, on the players and make it harder. Versus if you're maybe a bit leaner, it'll be easier.
And do we know if there's any a threshold there to pass over where too lean, that it actually can be a little bit more of it can head back towards a negative impact?
Definitely, we didn't really look at that as such, but I would think so, because obviously, Joe, if you're very, very too lean, it's probably a sign that you're in low energy availability or maybe not in a very a big calorie deficit or something like that. But I think the fact it was just maybe our cohort. So another analysis we did, we split them in two and compared high and low. And when you look at the low or the high body fat group, they're actually quite high. So I think the average for the high group is like 17%. So it's quite high. But I'd say if they were all maybe near 11 or 12 might be more optimal, I'd say. But I would say there definitely is, if you get too lean, it wouldn't help you anymore, I'd say, for sure.
And how did you measure the body fats for it?
So I suppose that's another issue in itself. Whatever calculation you're comparing, they're also different. So we just measured skin folds, and we were planning to maybe just use the raw skin fold number, because obviously there's no variation in that. But we got a calculation that's used in elite team sports and soccer quite frequently. So we use that rather than maybe a general population one. So I suppose it'd be easier to compare to maybe other team sports or see were they higher or lower.
Great. And was it a 7-site or 7-site?
7-site, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just thinking on the body composition as well, like there would be a bit of an individual set point there. Like one lad could, his best leanness might be 12%, someone else might be 9%, just again, genetically. Plus, I think what needs to be taken into account always there around body composition or even weight is the actual rate of change. That someone going from 17% down, like you might just have, say, at the end of the season, I want to get to 15, going from 17% to 12% over the course of the season. Just the general low energy availability there across the whole season could massively impact, obviously, energy levels, but recovery capacity, all like that as well. And same with someone looking to put on weight. If they put on weight too quickly, it might long term in 3 years' time be a good end weight to get to, but getting there too quickly can just have an awful lot of negative consequences, both in terms of ability to get around the field, recover, all like that. Bringing on then, you started looking at just kind of general recovery modalities that a lot of players are using. What's kind of common out there? What were you a little bit surprised at, and what like kind of is evidence supporting that?
Yeah, so I've kind of preliminary analysis done. So maybe on half it, I've kind of half analyzed maybe what. So we've kind of two sections to the survey. One is what they kind of perceive as good, and then the other is what they actually use. So I've kind of gone through most of the perceptions. But we had some interesting kind of biographic information, just kind of on their own training practices and things like that. So we found that so we got over 1,000 Gaelic Games athletes, first of all, and almost over 16% of these had 2 weeks or less of an annual off season. 15% reported no off season. So that was kind of over a third of all athletes had 2 weeks or less of a break during the year, which was an interesting point. As well as that, or 51% played another sport during the season, and then 52% played with another team. And this is kind of more prevalent in the inter-county players. But in terms of the recovery modalities then, in general, perceptions of the importance of recovery modalities kind of varied a lot between the different groups. So like a camogie was very different to handball, to Gaelic football, and then elite and sub-elite. But in general, we look at the overall group. The players ranked fluid replacement number 1, post-exercise meal consumption, and then stretching, active cool down, and then sleep and foam rolling. So in that order, those were the top 5 that they perceived as being the most effective strategies. But whether they are,
in a way, I'm really happy that like fluids, food, and sleep are there. But how to have like a cool down above sleep? I'm like, are you crazy?
The nutrition in me is delighted, and then the sleep expert not so much.
Even anecdotally, I could see that from my own club or teams that I work with, that sleep it's a kind of I better go to bed, sure I'm up in the morning for work, and it could be like 1 a.m. That you'll hear that from so many people, that there is, but I suppose in sport and out of sport as well. And I know we've just released a podcast there. By the time this comes out, it'll be a few weeks previous on sleep, but the amount of questions I'm getting 3 weeks previous, the amount of questions I'm getting, like, whoa, is that the case? And sleep seems to be something that people almost kind of just, it's like, oh, yeah, I sleep, but sure, that's kind of just a nuisance to me, as opposed to actually understanding the importance of it. So it's great that it's there, but Murphy, you're dead right. It's great that it's there. I was so worried. Now, I know it featured in, was it the top 5 there, was it, or with foam rolling? I was like so worried that was going to be like point number 1, but no, that's good.
And I'd assume as well that's kind of going to be age dependent as well. Like the younger people are definitely not going to factor sleep in because they think they're bulletproof.
Definitely. I haven't looked at age yet. We've so many groups. We've all the sports. You could go sub-elite, elite in each sport, and then there's lots of ways. But it's interesting to look at it so far, just kind of general points.
Before we dig into them, Lorcan, can you just briefly touch on, because it kind of sets up where the next block goes, but some of the differences between recovery and adaptation, that like when I'm recovered, I feel better, but am I soaking up and using the training to get fitter and stronger? Are they the same thing, or are there some differences there?
Yeah, so I suppose just to kind of maybe define them, that recovery maybe is the process of just getting back to what you had lost or getting back to what you were before exercise. But then adaptation is the kind of more complex process of the long-term responses to training, and that you're actually improving. So you can be training and recovering and just stay at the same level, or adaptation then deals with your kind of ongoing development. So there is definitely, that's a big area in recovery modalities and different ones. So they can have an influence on your responses to exercise. Some can be good or some can be bad, and these can kind of influence the long term. So in general, there's not too many studies looking at very long-term implications, maybe over a year or something, and ongoing training. So you just kind of have to maybe look at acute research and then kind of work forward from that, what you think might happen. But again, it depends a lot on what modality you're using, and they all have different mechanisms.
Because getting fitter, particularly through different components, fitness, they're different processes. It's not like if I go for a run versus go to the gym, like improve my aerobic fitness and my strength, they don't follow the same pathways in the body. They are quite different. So different recovery modalities will have different impacts on different things. Plus, some are way slower than others to actually take effect further down the line. That like sometimes, developing speed or power, like just raw, the ability to do it can actually take quite a while. Whereas in untrained, you can get a quick boost in strength or aerobic abilities, again, untrained fairly quickly. But for people who are more trained or at a higher level already, that can take longer. I need to be quite patient with it. And maybe some of the recovery stuff that you're doing to feel better could actually be blunting that in the long term, depending on what it is.
Definitely. And they all have different responses. So even, I suppose, just cold water immersion is probably a one that has the biggest influences. And that's kind of the one that kind of maybe highlight best the kind of more extreme advantages or disadvantages to recovery modalities. So that can have actually a serious blunting impact on maybe if you're trying to gain muscle size or strength. There's an awful lot of research showing that if you maybe use cold water immersion after a strength training session, that your responses will be quite blunted and you mightn't actually improve as much, whereas if you didn't. But it is very complex, I suppose, and there isn't such a blunting impact with maybe endurance performance or endurance exercise. So like you said, there is very different mechanisms in all these kind of training modalities. So it's important to kind of have an understanding of some physiology before you go jumping in an ice bath or whatever you're doing, so or kind of be some way informed.
And it would be quite common, I suppose, that similar recovery methods would be used no matter what the kind of training stimuli that was gone through. So that I think that's a massive point to actually take a look at, if you are planning your training sessions and the type of training that you're doing, to include your recovery plan as part of that training almost, and go, well, what am I doing here and why am I doing it? It's the same ways you'd ask, why you'd plan in skills into, say, a team or field sport or something like that, and you'd be asking yourself, well, why are we practicing this skill? What's the result we're looking for? I think that's incredibly important just point to note for anyone listening.
I remember being at a talk one time by a few different SSC coaches. I'm not going to say their names now, but two of them that spoke were working with different rugby teams, and one worked with, there were sevens tournaments, so over the course of the weekend they would take ice baths, because it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you could play 5 games. I think you could play 5 games, so using the ice bath to bring you back to baseline makes perfect sense. Whereas the next coach has stood up, absolutely fleeced it and saying, well, the research says that ice baths blunt adaptation, so we have thrown them all out and there's no way I would ever let any of my players near it. And I was like, I felt the first coach actually really justified why they were doing it. The second coach is, long season with a province. So it's very rare in like long season rugby, you're going to have game on game on game. You generally have like the longer break, so there probably shouldn't really be a need because you're always looking to adapt from training mainly, but games a bit. Whereas in the sevens influence there, where you just want to feel better going straight into your next game 6, 8, 12 hours later, I thought that was fair enough. Like,
Yeah, I think it's fairly prevalent in things like basketball as well, where it's a season that's very much back-to-back games, and you're kind of playing every 2 to 3 days. I think there's a big emphasis on cold water and ice baths.
Even for I suppose, the actual perceived recovery from it as opposed to the actual physiological, there is a kind of I suppose, a freshness. Like I mentioned, I was in sea swimming today. There's a freshness from getting into cold water, which, you know, even if it's not in around a training or performance, that you do feel kind of, you know, as I said, refreshed. So like that from that perspective, it's hard to rule something like that out. But yeah, I suppose using it efficiently would be the real thing.
sometimes it like sea swimming or going to a river and that, could it be a case, or even going to a swimming pool, could it just be a case of the weight, or not weightlessness, but, you know, less supporting of your own body weight and just, you know, loosening through the spine and lower body? Can that have as much of an effect as opposed to the actual cold water, which might not even be that cold with the weather we're currently having?
Yeah, so I suppose that's hydrostatic pressure. That's kind of well researched as well. But that I think has big impacts on, like we say, subjective muscle soreness. So you definitely feel a lot better, and kind of improve your mood and things like that. It probably has some, we'll say, benefits in kind of increasing blood flow, maybe lymphatic stuff, things like that. Some kind of CK clearance. But I suppose the sport can be very stressful if you have lots of training sessions, and definitely psychological recovery and your mood and all that definitely has a big impact. So it's very important to consider as well.
And with the actual, I suppose we're starting to see recovery rooms and stuff jump up around the place now. when and how they're used is, I have some question marks around them, but often we'll see the protocol when you go in there is that you go from cold, like a cryo bath or something like that, into an infrared sauna. And for a lot of people, that's kind of it. You might go into the infrared and then into jacuzzi and then out again. But I remember coming across, I had to do a paper myself a few years ago for my master's, where what I got from it, I'm looking at this little bit of recovery on thermal recovery, and it was more that you needed to go over and back from real cold, like I think it was between, I don't know, was it 1 and 8 degrees or something like that, or 1 and 5, maybe 5, 6, 7 degrees, something like that, and then up to like pretty seriously warm quite rapidly to create that flushing kind of effect where you had to go over and back. So have you seen much in that line where you do need to use the two together, and if you are using them together, you do need to kind of go, say, cold, hot, back to cold, back to hot, or is that kind of, you know, has that been kind of, you know, I suppose maybe thrown out a little?
Yeah, no, I think that it's quite probably similarly effective to maybe cold water immersion, the kind of contrast therapy. It does a similar thing. I think it gets blood flow, say, going to the core and then back when you're alternating to and from. So I think the mechanisms are quite similar in that you're getting the exposure and kind of, would say, increased vasodilation and vasoconstriction. That's kind of causing this, we say, like a pump effect, like you mentioned. But I think I've seen a few studies now where they're kind of maybe comparing contrast and then just cold on its own and passive. And I think the contrast and the cold water immersion have kind of similar responses to maybe a small increase in performance and CK clearance, whereas the passive might be a little bit weaker. So I'd say they're quite similar in the mechanisms, but there might maybe some different scenarios, whatever state of inflammation you are, maybe different time scales you might use them. But I'm not too familiar with the in-depth, maybe what we said time or day or hour should you maybe alternate or one to another.
And in other responses then around like what people did for recovery, what are some of the ones that are, big, strong evidence base for this? And what are some of the ones you maybe saw and you're like, what? You absolute loony. Where did this come out?
So I suppose just because we so much, I think we had 38 options. So we had all sorts of recovery. Like there was a few kind of peculiar.
And was there an
ones.
option to like add your own that you're like, what is this?
No, I would like to even have to read all those or kind of go through that. So I left that out. But yeah, there was 38 options, and just off the top of my head, some very like there was strange options, maybe aromatherapy or different things like that. But I don't think they were too popular as you might expect. So I just kind of went with maybe the top 8 for each group and then compared them. But I think just comparing, the same study was done in various team sports in South African athletes, so volleyball and I think maybe soccer and things like that. So there was quite a few differences. The Gaelic Games athletes rank stretching very high, whereas there's not much of a prevalence in the other athletes. So they kind of, I think, I just have a few notes on it here, but stretching was rated very high in, I think, camogie. It was the second most highly rated for recovery. But in terms of doing a job for recovery, like obviously stretching is great to maybe increase range of motion or reduce some kind of stiffness, but it is very limited application for actually improving your performance back to baseline. So maybe they're kind of using it for the wrong job, or there's might be some misunderstanding. So a lot of the athletes, I think even the elite, the intercounty athletes, had stretching way ahead of sleep. So that might show some kind of disparity there.
Was yoga an option, or were people using yoga and stretching interchangeably? Maybe.
I don't think yoga was an option. I probably just under the umbrella stretching that it was, if they probably want to click it. But obviously it'll give you good, we'll say, perceived mood and things like that. But in terms of studies looking at, they have a passive recovery versus a stretching. There's very limited real benefit in, we'll say, a day or two's time. You'll probably be as ready to train whether you do or don't. But it will, I'm sure it'll reduce maybe some soreness or stiffness. But in terms of performance, which is kind of what we're most interested in, there's not much of an effect.
And what kind of does have the most evidence then? If, like, say, right, yeah, we want to recover, we want to do what's best, and whatever people around me are saying, I'm just going to block that out. I want to know what's going to give me the best bang for my buck now if I want to recover.
Yeah, so basically there's a wide range of recovery modalities, and the majority of them kind of only have an impact on, we'll say, perceived muscle soreness, subjective mood and things like that. So they actually don't really have an impact on performance measures. So there's many different things like compression garments, loaded therapies that are kind of under that bracket, where they make the athletes feel better, but they don't necessarily promote the recovery. It's actually very limited, really, the recovery modalities that will actually bring you back faster. So maybe ice baths, cold water immersion, they will probably do that. But I suppose, again, you have to think of the context of what time of the season. You could be, maybe in the short term, you could be more recovered, but at the expense of maybe your long-term adaptations. You have to take it in context. So it might be best maybe in season, important matches surrounding that, you might go for it, but then off season, when you're trying to develop, maybe avoid them. But aside from that, really, it's just the literature is very trivial on all these kind of modalities, and it's just I suppose, nutrition, appropriate training programs, and even my own research suggests increasing your fitness is actually going to increase your recovery ability. So between that and then nutrition, and if you need cold water or some kind of ice bath, and aside from that, all the others just have kind of subjective benefits, it seems, from kind of literature reviews.
And have we, or have you seen any kind of, say, time? Say if we take the Gaelic footballer, where we might see, like you mentioned, that they're like that younger player that you mentioned that was quite high on the creatine kinase levels there. Do we know if there should be a certain amount of time between, say, trainings and games, and then like how to, like, I suppose, getting towards the practical application side of kind of your findings? What should coaches be looking to implement in their strategies, whether it's, the type of training that they do in the lead up to a game, or the maybe how far away from a game they should be training? Because I suppose, anecdotally, I would come across teams who'll swear by, we need to go for a kick around the night before a game. More teams then, it could be 2 nights before a game, and they have maybe a short but very high intense training session. More teams then might do barely, anything, a night or two before a session. But do you have any kind of, look, those practical takeaways, really, of like how to maybe start to put some better structure on things?
Yeah, so I suppose it's very complex, and there's going to be such individual variability. Player A might definitely need a modality. He might be doing too much, maybe multi-team exposure, things like that, and a recovery modality might be great for him. But then another player who's maybe had minimal game time, only one sport, a recovery modality might actually be to his detriment. He might nearly lose fitness as a result. So it varies, I suppose, case to case. And then just in terms of the weekly structure, there's ways that you can, I suppose, you've to kind of, especially in the in season, you have to balance things so that they're not losing any fitness, but that they're not too fatigued for the next match, we say Sunday. So you have to kind of balance around that. But just, I suppose, my own format, we say, like, if they had a match Sunday, might be a rest Monday, and then maybe something like a gym work Tuesday with maybe more of an upper body focus if it was a bit strenuous. And then you could do something like Wednesday, maybe some acceleration work or GA training. And then we say Thursday, you could do some kind of power work or kind of lighter gym session to just kind of prime themselves going forward. And then maybe another training Friday, and then we say the day off Saturday or something like that. But there's different ways you can, I suppose, manipulate the training. Even down below that, you can adapt the resistance training so that there's kind of more stimulus and less fatigue. But then with the recovery modalities, I'd kind of maybe hold back on them for less important games, and then just kind of maybe use them for when it's most important, when you're not really thinking about your long term, it's championship or whatever. It's important.
We'll touch on psychological impact in a minute, but you mentioned there when you're listing off things that have good, decent evidence behind it to work. And you actually mentioned training programs, but when sitting down and planning out the next week, the next month, or the majority of the season, factoring in where training is, when we go hard, how we build up to going hard, and like that.
Yeah.
It's probably going to have one of the biggest impacts on recovery of all. And that if we're planning incrementally to get players fitter and stronger and build up a workload and a tolerance to workload, it's possibly going to have it's really going to be your most important thing overall.
Definitely. Like my own research, just looking at the impact of physical condition, it's very powerful. There could be, you could be 20 or 30% more prepared if you're in the fitter group, and that's going to be a way more. If with these recovery modalities, it might be a small trivial benefit, whereas if you're just fitter going into the game, it's going to be kind of water off a duck's back in some ways, and that you'll be ready to train very quick, compared to a less conditioned athlete. So you're definitely right. I think the structure of training and being just prepared for what your demands are, that's the number one thing by a long shot, really.
It probably needs to be planned well in advance. Like if you're there in May and you have a championship starting in June, okay, we're going to get really, really fit now, so they recover really quick in June. You probably need to be looking at that from January and slowly building up that base of both strength and aerobic conditioning to be able to cope with the demands later on of the harder, in-season stuff where you have game on game and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. So just even some of the kind of most of these literature reviews or analysis on the recovery modalities, they kind of have similar conclusions, and that they're saying when you're in the off season and pre-season, you should be looking to amplify the training stress. So you actually want to be fatigued, and you want to say high mechanical tension and things like that. And it doesn't matter about your short-term performance, and that you're gaining fitness. And then maybe towards the competitive end, you could maybe implement some modality to heighten preparedness or improve recovery. So again, it's very context dependent, so.
And we touched on the psychological impact, but it's something as well that's hugely individual, that if, like, I wouldn't see much impact from a foam roller or from stretching, but if a player in their head feels I will be more recovered and I will be better prepared for training Tuesday even from the match in the morning if I do a foam rolling session Monday evening, like, I wouldn't deter him from that. I kind of say that, like, there are better things you could do, but if you're happy to do that and you feel good, go on, have at it, good lad. And probably a few things like that, and that, like, if they're happy enough to, individually do it, plus they need to balance that up with the stress that some players, if getting an ice bath really, really stresses them out, that they just don't like cold, or the thoughts of getting in stresses them so much, that's probably something you'll pull them back from a bit. And it's probably in a way why some of the recovery rooms work well, that there's a bit of choice when you go in there. Someone might like spinning on a bike and foam rolling. Someone might like sitting in water because they like being comfortable in water. Different things that way.
Oh, definitely. I fully agree. Like, even just like if you believe something is doing you good, it probably is, just because you're getting that effective belief. But there is definitely like side effect benefits, maybe, Joe, even the things like the recovery rooms, or if you're in with the team and it's good crack, Joe, you can relax and all that. Like all that can definitely, we'll say, help alleviate psychological stress, improve recovery. So they probably do work in that they're having the like a compound benefit on mood and muscle soreness and all that. So there's so many factors to incorporate in the psychological aspect that, but that definitely has a huge impact.
So I know this wasn't specifically the area of the study, but on the flip side of what we're talking about, is there anything that's particularly bad for recovery as opposed to things we can do to improve it, rather than things we should avoid that are going to hamper it completely? Like drinking kind of comes to mind first of all, but is there anything like that that's hugely bad for recovery?
I suppose there's two areas that you could go wrong, even just looking at the different modalities. Well, I suppose, like you said, with the ice baths, if you go to a very extreme protocol, it can blunt responses. So, like the research showing that actually reduced your gains, whatever they had, maybe very extreme protocols. It might be like 2 bouts at 20 minutes in like 3 degrees, which is very tough. So maybe a less strenuous thing. And then in a similar fashion, if you were doing active recovery after a game, and let's say it kind of went on too long or was a bit more strenuous, that could nearly add fatigue in some ways, or maybe hamper kind of glycogen resynthesis or recovery. And in a similar way, stretching as well, if you're kind of going very harsh stretching, that can actually nearly make you more sore or give you more jams. So it's kind of a balance and things like that. You nearly wants to be at a kind of relaxed pace, a lot of these things. And if you go too far, you could be just piling on more fatigue or soreness. So
Did you see any correlation there between those who reported saying having 2 weeks or no time off, between, or no off season basically, between their seasons, and their perceived levels of recovery, or even objective levels of recovery? Like, do they find that actually they're not progressing? Or do you see anything like that? Maybe anecdotally, we could all possibly, kind of hazard our own views towards this, but I'd love to know from the data that you pulled together there, if there was anything stood out.
yeah, I haven't looked at that yet, but that's definitely the way we've it structured. You can, if they answer whatever 2 weeks, I can analyze that and then compare it back. So we could look at that going forward. But I suppose, Joe, if you had no time off all year, some of them 15%, and then a third have 2 weeks or less, Joe, you'd probably have to be at risk of even psychological burnout and all that. It's hard to keep going for that long, and if you have lots of teams, and whatever about the physical end, it's good to have, we say, some kind of active rest or a period off from the year just to fully recover. But you'd wonder if some teams, maybe some players aren't doing any form of deloads or things like that throughout the year. So it can be a very tough year, especially if you take zero time off, like 15% had. But it would be interesting. I haven't done it yet, but if we kind of correlated that back, it would be interesting.
I'm just kind of wondering how some of the actual modalities actually work, like what's happening. But one of the things that seems to jump out to me there is an awful lot of it seems to be about just turning down the dial on the amount of stress your body's going through at a time. But like playing games, particularly really, really important games, they're high stress environments, not just on the body, but just, internally in general. You're having, a lot of fluids and stuff released around the body, like adrenaline, cortisol, all that. But just calming the body down through, as you said, like, play a match Sunday, tough day at work Monday, going to a recovery room and playing a bit of Xbox with a few lads, that can just calm people down really well. So they have a good sleep then afterwards. And that might be what's leading to the recovery. And to me, that would be one of the big things that jumps out. What happens in some of the other modalities, like in an ice bath or in compression garments? What's actually happening there that seems to have an impact? Do we even know? Has that been dug into enough yet?
Yeah, so I suppose with the ice baths and cold water immersion, they're kind of, the mechanisms behind them are probably a bit more researched than the others. So in terms of how it has a negative influence on, we say, resistance training, it kind of switches off, or it kind of dampens a lot, we say, anabolic signaling. So your muscles or your body's signal to grow muscle, the kind of cold temperatures can kind of dampen that, whether it's through reduced blood flow or some other way. And then but it has other kind of physiological effects. It can kind of reduce acute inflammation from muscle damage, and then thus reduce muscle soreness. And there's other mechanisms like that. With the compression garments, what they're trying to do is increase femoral blood flow, so kind of reduce blood flow to the extremities, and then kind of maybe bring it back to the core and different things like that. But there is a lot physiologically going on. And with the ice baths, actually, on with say the endurance training, it has kind of all these mechanistic properties. So like some actually benefit endurance, the cold responses, and then some have some negative effects. So I suppose you just have to look at the balance overall. Is it going to improve or disimprove your performance? So, but there is a lot physiologically going on when you're exposed to cold or these kind of extreme protocols.
And like around, because a lot of it seems to be around blood flow and stuff and inflammation. Is inflammation a bad thing, or in the small acute bouts, is inflammation what's actually leading to these gains essentially?
Yeah, so I think I think it is in the long term. You do need all the full inflammation response, whatever mechanical tension. You need to be in a high stress, physiological stress for your body to want to adapt. But if in a scenario where you have a championship game Sunday, you want to dampen, you want to get rid of that stress, that inflammation, all that. So you want to come back quicker. So that's when I think you should use them. But definitely that's probably why they kind of blunt the responses. They just take away the stress. So it's as if you have only done half the work you did. That's why you don't get maybe the full results. So that seems logical anyway.
That's very interesting. Normatec boots, what's happening there?
Yeah, I read up on them just when you mentioned it there on Twitter. So I suppose they work in a similar way that active recovery works. So even theoretically, I think they might actually be a little bit better than active recovery because there's no additive fatigue. You're just sitting there. But I have a slide here on them now. They're probably in the same bracket as most of the other modalities in that most of the benefits are kind of perceived. So I suppose the thing with that the Normatec boots does and that active recovery does, okay, so it removes lactate faster than if you just did nothing. So then you say, all right, well, maybe that's great for recovery, but really in a day or two's time, it doesn't actually translate into improved recovery. So in the short term, if you have to do something in the next 30 minutes, it's going to be a good benefit. But in a day or two's time, it probably doesn't really matter too much. But it does have the kind of psychological benefits. It'll reduce muscle soreness, things like that in similar fashion to the others. So it's probably in the same benefit as those. But in terms of actually getting you back to baseline quicker, probably no major impact really.
And like foam rollers, massage guns, even like getting massage, like I follow cycling fairly hard. I notice most of the top cyclists get a massage every night going through the tours. What's happening there when they're getting massage and stuff? And is it similar enough to foam rolling that there could be benefits there, or again, is it very individual that I just feel better after it?
Yeah, so massage is actually probably the most powerful subjective improver by a long shot. So you really do feel better, feel reduced DOMS. I think I would say I suppose you class massage as kind of just rhythmical pressure or different stroke, and so I wouldn't think it'd matter too much whether it's a massage gun or a therapist once there's kind of similar pressures and things like that. But in general, I suppose if you have muscle spasms or stiff or sore, it can definitely alleviate that. But in terms of, say, if you had a group of players, you give them a massage and then another group didn't, in a day's time, they'd probably be similar prepared to train. So it doesn't have much of an impact on muscular performance in a day or two, but it has probably the most powerful impact on subjective measures. So you feel a lot better, your mood goes up, you're not as sore, things like that, and it can help alleviate stiffness. Or if we say you were a player, just not in a recovery context, but in a training context, if you did some kind of massage or foam rolling prior to maybe strength training, the fact that the massage relax your muscles a bit, you might be able to get into bigger ranges of motion, and then having done the strength training with this range of motion, you might kind of have more long-term range of motion. But a lot of stuff on massage or kind of foam roll in terms of range of motion, it'll give you a benefit for maybe 10 minutes at most, and then it kind of goes back. So it's more the subjective benefits or what you'd be looking for with recovery.
I've seen a few say around foam rolling that like try not to make it your immediate thing to jump on it. Like if you're going gym and you're going squatting, actually try a few squats first and use the squats to warm you up. If that starts to loosen you out, keep going. If the squats haven't loosened you out, try a little bit of foam rolling around a specific area. That might loosen you up for the next 10 minutes of going doing your squats or whatever your working set is. It'll allow you to do them. And then hopefully the strength gains from doing them through the correct range of motion over the long term will lead to that correct range of motion staying there because you're strong through the range you want to be in.
No, I think that's 100% right. Like the foam roll in that context, it like gives you a quick window where you have more range of motion artificially, and then if you train in that range of motion, it becomes your kind of long-term motive. Or like in a squat, maybe if you had, would say, tight groins or tight calves, if you foam roll those. So I know you think if you're squatting, you might foam roll your quads to get more range, but really, if you got your, we say, your calves and your quads, they're probably the limiters to your range of motion, and then you could get into bigger depth and things like that. So they would have definitely a benefit for long-term range of motion in that kind of context, I would think.
And I've noticed, Shane, there you rock your Whoop band, and we've chatted to a few people about it. But when they give like recovery scores and stuff like that, like there are obviously all the question marks around how accurate and all they are. But what are they based on recovery on? Like, there's no, well, maybe we don't know about. They're like these tiny little pinpricks that are measuring creatine kinase or something like that. But are they basing it all off heart rate? Are they have just a load of inputs coming in from sleep, stress the day before, everything like that, to give you a recovery score, or what's kind of based around?
I'm actually not sure entirely what they pull their numbers off. But I just off the top of my head, I've seen some studies that said that they weren't actually too accurate. But definitely, if you could, maybe if does the watch like ask you a question and you might input 1 to 5, are you prepared or sore or something?
So it kind of gives you a survey every morning when you wake up, and it'll you can set your own kind of journal, for lack of a better word, or what questions it ask you. So you can set, like if you get a massage once a week, you can set, it'll ask you in the morning, like, I got a massage today, and then you can kind of, at the end of the month, it gives you a report and it'll show you whatever your recovery score is each day, and you'll say on days that you did this, you were 10% more better recovered over the course of the month, or things like that. So it's good even just as a log of everything you've done. How they actually get all the information, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's a combination of stress levels along with sleep. But I think we've kind of mentioned it before. I think all these wearables are kind of in their infancy. I think if we look 3, 4, 5 years down the line, they'll be very in-depth and very good and kind of a great marker. But for now, they are early. So hopefully, as companies, they'll kind of accept as much feedback as they can and kind of work to better themselves rather than work to kind of make a product they can make the most money off of.
I'd assume resting heart rate comes in there. I always find
it does.
If I'm recovered, not recovered, resting heart rate has a huge impact, or bounce. It's hugely impacted. Like, are there any other like things people use to monitor recovery? I suppose obviously your general wellness questionnaires are probably the most used out there.
Yeah, I suppose you want something quick and easy to administer. You don't want to be buying more equipment in most team settings. So the questionnaires are probably very good. I suppose another, like if you had a performance measure, like even we said the drop jump or counter movement jump, even the equipment for those is quite expensive. But if you really wanted to monitor your preparedness, maybe something like a broad jump, you could even just do that yourself. And if it was way down what you usually do, you might be still sore or not prepared, or if it was good, you might be okay. So that could be a simple, maybe just a 1 to 5 questionnaire. And if you really wanted, maybe do a broad jump to assess where you are. That would be probably a good monitoring package, but that's entirely free. Like,
I'd have used vertical jump a good bit in the past with teams. I don't want to be because just with not allowed to use gesture rooms and all like that, it's too awkward to set up. I have actually found it really, really useful to see, particularly if you're planning to do sprint in a trend some evening and you notice that at least half the lads their jump is down a bit, you're like, I'm not going to get any benefit from sprinting, so have to change the plan slightly or whatever that way. Plus, it just opens up conversation that with the game Saturday, we're training Tuesday and a load of vertical jumps are down. You're like, what is that? Like, why did this happen? Some people have used HRV. It's something I know very, very little about. Is it something you've looked into at any stage?
Not really. I'm just aware that it is used, and that there's some accuracy to it, but I wouldn't be able to tell you much about it. I haven't looked into it really. But it's just, I suppose, another tool in the toolbox that you could use, maybe in combination with other things. They give you a good picture overall.
Yeah, that's true. Like, it's about just painting a picture overall, because there are so many individual differences on all this between psychological and physical readiness and everything, that it can be difficult. I know one of my neighbours who would have hurled a Carlo for a good few years, they did a knee to wall just to see where ankle mobility was, and he found for himself individually it was the best predictor of all, because he hurt his ankle a few years beforehand, and when he wasn't recovered, it just tightened up, and doing that little ankle or knee over the toe to see where he was, if it was kind of 2 centimeters less, he just knew himself, yeah, that makes perfect sense because I feel absolutely wrecked. Whereas I always thought, that's a crazy one. Why would you do that one? Whereas he said, yeah, it made perfect sense to me. None of the others really made as much of a difference.
Right. Yeah. I suppose it is very individual, and it depends what you want to do and what you want to look at, right?
What are your kind of final stages then of the studies? What are the last kind of little things you want to look into? And then PhD finished, you have a little bit of freedom around, okay, where can I go study wise? What are the one or two big questions I really want to go and answer for myself, as opposed to just to get this hat in the head that can throw up in the air?
Yeah, I'm not too sure, but to be honest, I really do. I'm starting to really like the whole research process, and if down the line, I would definitely like to explore more things, maybe in intercounty players, or just kind of go into more in-depth studies over long term. That would be something I'd like to do, but I don't know whether if that's a viable option or not. I'm not too sure. But I haven't really given it too much thought. I'm just trying to get the whole thing finished now at the minute. But for, I suppose, what we're doing, we have a study and review at the minute looking at the impact of physical conditioning on performance attenuation and recovery, and then hopefully we'll get the one out looking at the components of fitness. So we did more analysis on that, just kind of in-depth stuff, just to get a real kind of good picture of what's kind of going on or what's important in terms of physical conditioning. And then with that, I suppose just to get through all the perceptions, so we've done we've the analysis kind of done on that, and then we're going to look at see what players actually use. So obviously I've mentioned what they kind of perceive to be good, but then to see, does it line up what they use, and then see if, well, what do they use? Is it actually effective, or are they kind of, maybe could they do things more efficiently or something like that? So that would be interesting. And then maybe down the line we could work off recommendations from that.
Yeah, pull together a little intervention or something like that. I think
Yeah,
I saw one
maybe.
where with a group did they train both arms like bicep curls, and one did 10 minutes or whatever it was in ice, with the left, or randomized, and half did left arm and ice, right arm did not, and the other half did right arm and ice, left arm did not. And they found perceived recovery that the left arm, or the one that was nice, felt way better, but when they actually mentioned muscle gain and strength gain, it was quite down in the arm that was iced, which I suppose is one of your best ways to do it. I think some long-term stuff there around ice baths stuff will be so interesting, but setting it up to actually answer the right question could be difficult enough.
Yeah, so I suppose that just a thing, my own interest with the ice baths. So, like a lot of the studies, the participants are either untrained or have very low training status. So we'll say, like in the of Gaelic games, if very high demands, they could play a role in that. It's allowing you to undertake the training. If you were, say, doing on the end of too much, it might bring you down into the kind of sweet spot. So it'd be interesting to see, maybe it mightn't hamper it so much if you're kind of doing more to compensate. It'd be interesting to explore in the long term, I think, anyway.
Depends a bit, I suppose, as well on the stages of the season, what you're actually looking to do. Like if you're doing the classic 15 on, 15 off, because there is a bit of a neuromuscular adaptation there, you'd be concerned it might blunt that a bit. But if you're doing, if you look at your endurance runners, that kind of base phase, I don't know, would a GA team ever actually get a chance to do a base phase? I think later on the season it could actually make a huge difference, but selling that to a team of GA players would be so hard. I think it could actually be useful then, because there often isn't a huge neuromuscular load there. It's more like heart, lungs, all like that you could be implanted there to increase volume for a period of time, just to have it there that you could play around with for recovery later on the season. Any other questions you want to hop in with, Shane?
No, that's been really good, really interesting. I think definitely there's a lot more research to be done in the area. I think it's just going to kind of get more and more popular, so it'll be really cool to see where it goes.
No, Lorcan, that's been absolutely brilliant. If you want to plug out in there, plug away, but thanks a million for your time.
No, I've nothing to plug anyway. Thanks a million for having me on anyway. It's very good.
Thank you. That was excellent, really insightful now, and I hope people get something from it, that they can plan out their own kind of recovery practices, and I think plan out their own training logically, which would probably have the biggest impact on all like that. And best luck with the last couple of months of the PhD.
Sound. Thanks a million, John. I'll see you, lads.